A split-second decision, a flash of anger on a luxury jet cruising at 40,000 feet. For one flight attendant, it was a moment of asserting control over a passenger she deemed unworthy. For the passenger, a quiet African-American woman in a simple grey hoodie, it was the final stinging insult in a flight filled with unspoken prejudice. What the attendant didn't know was that the hand she raised wasn't just against a customer. It was against the very woman who owned the multi-million-dollar airframe they were sitting in. This isn't a story of simple, mistaken identity. It's a chilling, real-life account of how silent power responds when challenged, and how karma, when it finally arrives, can be delivered with devastating precision. The cabin of the Gulfstream G700 was an oasis of engineered tranquility. Polished mahogany whispered of old money, while cream-colored leather seats, soft as a sigh, promised unparalleled comfort. The air was filtered, smelling faintly of citrus and success. It was the kind of environment where the clinking of ice in a crystal glass was the loudest sound, a place designed to insulate its occupants from the harsh realities of the world they soared over at 43,000 feet. Dr. Hannah Braddock, however, was not insulated. She was, in fact, acutely aware of the world. It was her obsessive attention to its details, its energy needs, its data streams, its latent potentials that had allowed her to build Aura Innovations from a garage startup into a global technology empire worth over $50 billion. She had revolutionized grid-scale battery storage, and her name was whispered with the same reverence as giants like Musk or Gates in the circles that mattered. But today she was not Dr. Braddock, titan of industry. She was just Hannah, a woman in a comfortable, well-worn grey hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of simple sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a neat but unadorned puff. Her only accessory was a slim, powerful laptop on which she was reviewing schematics for a new philanthropic project, a network of solar-powered water purifiers for sub-Saharan Africa. She chose to fly this way on occasion on one of her own planes, managed by the Executive Fleet Charter Service. It was her version of secret shopping, a way to see firsthand how the company she entrusted with her assets treated its clientele, especially those who didn't fit the stereotypical mold. The flight attendant, Elizabeth Flowers, had made her assessment of Hannah the moment she stepped on board. Elizabeth, a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and a mouth permanently pursed in judgment, saw not a titan of industry, but a mistake, an anomaly. She saw the casual clothes, the simple backpack, and the dark skin, and her internal calculus produced a single damning result: doesn't belong. Elizabeth had worked in private aviation for 15 years. She considered herself a gatekeeper of luxury, a curator of the elite experience. She prided herself on her ability to anticipate the needs of senators, CEOs, and celebrities. She also harbored a deep, simmering resentment for them, a bitterness that she masked with a veneer of flawless, icy professionalism. But for those she deemed interlopers, the mask slipped. Her first interaction with Hannah was clipped. "May I see your boarding confirmation, please?" She'd asked, her voice laced with a skepticism she didn't bother to hide. Most passengers on a private charter were simply greeted by name and welcomed aboard. Hannah, looking up from her phone, smiled politely. "Of course." She showed the confirmation on her screen. Elizabeth squinted at it, holding her tablet close, as if expecting a forgery. "Braddock. Seat 3A. She gestured vaguely. "Your seat is there." There was no warmth, no "Welcome aboard, Miss Braddock," no offer to take her coat. Hannah merely nodded and settled into her seat, pulling out her laptop. She'd felt the chill, noted it, and filed it away. This was precisely the kind of data she was here to collect. Throughout the initial ascent, The difference in service was stark. The two other passengers, a pair of white businessmen in crisp suits, were treated with fawning deference. Elizabeth laughed at their bland jokes, refilled their glasses of Macallan 25 before they were empty, and spoke to them in conspiratorial, hushed tones. For Hannah, service was a grudging afterthought. When she requested a simple bottle of water, Elizabeth returned a full 2 minutes later, placing it on the small table beside Hannah with a quiet thud that felt deliberately dismissive. She didn't ask if she needed anything else. She simply turned and walked away. The junior flight attendant, a young woman named Kate with wide, nervous eyes, watched these interactions with growing unease. It was only her 3rd month with Executive Fleet, and she was still terrified of making a mistake. She had been trained to provide seamless, invisible service to everyone. Elizabeth's overt hostility toward one passenger was confusing and deeply uncomfortable. Kate tried to compensate, offering Hannah a warm blanket and a selection of snacks with a genuine smile, earning a sharp, warning glare from Elizabeth. Hannah noticed Kate's kindness and Elizabeth's corresponding glare. More data points. She gave Kate a small, appreciative smile that made the young woman blush and scurry away. An hour into the flight from Los Angeles to the private jet hub at Teterboro, New Jersey, Elizabeth was serving coffee. She navigated the aisle with practiced ease, the silver pot in her hand, a symbol of her domain. She topped off the businessmen's cups, sharing another quiet laugh. As she passed Hannah's seat, the plane hit a brief, minor pocket of turbulence, a gentle shudder that was common at this altitude. But for Elizabeth it was an opportunity. A small, almost imperceptible tilt of her wrist, a slight overcorrection in her balance. It was a movement so subtle only someone looking for it would have noticed. A stream of hot, dark coffee cascaded from the spout, missing the cup on the tray and splashing directly onto Hannah's laptop keyboard. The hot coffee spread across the sleek, silver surface of the laptop like a dark stain. A few drops sizzled, and the screen flickered violently before going black. The smell of burnt sugar and electronics filled the small space around seat 3A. Hannah's reaction was instantaneous, but controlled. She gasped more from the shock of the heat on her fingertips than anything else, and quickly grabbed a napkin to blot the liquid, her movements swift and efficient. The schematics on that drive weren't just for a charity project. They represented months of proprietary research and development from Aura's top engineers. While everything was backed up to her company's hypersecure cloud, the hardware itself was a custom-built, encrypted prototype worth more than a luxury car. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with annoyance, not apology. She made no move to help. Instead, she stood with the coffee pot still in hand, looking down at Hannah with an expression of profound irritation, as if Hannah herself had willed the coffee to leap from the pot. "You should really be more careful with your things in the aisle," Elizabeth continued, her tone accusatory. "We're on an aircraft. Turbulence happens." The sheer audacity of the statement struck Hannah silent for a moment. The turbulence had been negligible, a tremor at most. The spill was a direct result of Elizabeth's carelessness, or as Hannah was beginning to suspect, her malice. "I believe you're mistaken," Hannah said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the cabin's hum. The two businessmen paused their conversation, glancing over. "My laptop was securely on my table, well away from the aisle. You spilled the coffee." Elizabeth's lips thinned into a bloodless line. Being corrected was one thing. Being corrected by this woman was in her mind an intolerable offense. Her authority in this cabin was absolute. The aircraft jolted. She insisted, her voice rising slightly. "It's not my responsibility to babysit passengers' electronics. It is, however, your responsibility to perform your duties with a reasonable standard of care." Hannah countered, her legal team's favorite phrases coming to mind. She was no longer just collecting data. A line had been crossed. And it is standard procedure to apologize when you cause damage to a passenger's property. This was the ultimate challenge. Elizabeth saw it as a full frontal assault on her station. In her world, people like Hannah were meant to be silent, grateful for the privilege of breathing the same rarefied air as her preferred clientele. They were not supposed to talk back, to quote standards to demand apologies. "There is nothing to apologize for," Elizabeth snapped. "Perhaps if you used equipment suitable for travel instead of some cheap toy, it wouldn't be so fragile." She glanced at the now dark laptop with contempt. The younger attendant, Kate, who had been emerging from the galley, froze. She had seen the whole thing. She saw the slight, deliberate tilt of Elizabeth's wrist. She knew the turbulence was barely a shimmer. She stood paralyzed by the conflict, her desire to speak the truth, warring with her fear of the senior attendant. Elizabeth ruled the junior staff with an iron fist, and Kate knew that contradicting her would mean the end of her fledgling career. "This cheap toy," Hannah said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm level, "is a piece of proprietary hardware valued at over $200,000, and the data on it is worth exponentially more." She carefully closed the lid of the ruined machine. "I will need your name and employee number. I need to file a formal incident report with the executive fleet for the damage." The demand for an official report was a declaration of war. It escalated the situation from a private disagreement to a corporate matter, one that would require paperwork, explanations, and accountability. It was a direct threat to Elizabeth's carefully constructed world. Elizabeth felt a hot surge of rage cloud her vision. The injustice of it all. She had to scrimp and save to endure the whims of the arrogant rich for 15 years to maintain this facade of perfect service. And this woman, this hoodie-wearing interloper who had likely won some diversity lottery to be on this flight, was threatening to ruin it all over a spilled drink. The complex cocktail of her resentment, her prejudice, and her insecurity reached its boiling point. "You will do no such thing," Elizabeth hissed, stepping closer, invading Hannah's personal space. Her face was a mask of fury. "You are a guest on this aircraft, and you will show some respect. You will not be filing any reports. Is that clear?" Hannah met her gaze without flinching. Her calmness seemed to infuriate Elizabeth even more. "I am a client who has paid for a service, and part of that service is not having my property destroyed through negligence. I am asking for your details one last time. Provide them now." Hannah began to stand up, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone used to being in command. She was not a large woman, but in that moment, she seemed to fill the space, her presence demanding a response. For Elizabeth, this was the final provocation. In her mind, the woman was not just standing up to her. She was rising above her station. It was an act of defiance that her prejudiced mind couldn't tolerate. The years of pent-up anger, the feeling of being a servant to the undeserving, the sight of this calm, dark-skinned woman refusing to be intimidated, it all coalesced into a single ugly impulse. Control snapped. Logic fled. There was only raw, unadulterated fury. "You will sit down," Elizabeth snarled. And then she raised her hand. The slap was not a tentative tap. It was a sharp, cracking sound that echoed through the hushed cabin with the force of a gunshot. Elizabeth's palm connected with Hannah's cheek, the impact snapping Hannah's head to the side. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The low hum of the engines seemed to vanish. The world inside the Gulf Stream, G700, contracted to that single violent moment. The two businessmen stared their mouths agape, whiskey glasses frozen halfway to their lips. This was a level of raw, unprofessional ugliness they had never witnessed in their hermetically sealed world. Kate, standing by the galley, let out a tiny, involuntary gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She felt as though she had just witnessed a taboo being broken, a sacred line, not just crossed, but obliterated. Hannah did not cry out. She did not stumble. She simply stood there, her head still turned to the side, the bright red imprint of a hand beginning to bloom on her dark skin. She slowly, deliberately brought her head back to face Elizabeth. Her eyes were not filled with tears or rage. They were cold, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a terrifyingly calm and focused gaze, the look of a scientist observing a specimen that had just performed a fascinating yet fatal act. The warmth that had been in her expression when she'd smiled at Kate was gone, replaced by something as hard and brilliant as a diamond. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed as shocked by her own action as anyone else. Her hand tingled her arm, hanging limply at her side. The adrenaline that had fueled her rage was rapidly being replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. What had she done? She had assaulted a passenger on a private charter. It was the cardinal sin of her profession, an act from which there was no recovery. Her mind scrambled for justification, for a way to reframe the narrative. She provoked me. She was aggressive. She was threatening. The lies formed weak and flimsy in the face of the stark reality of what everyone had just witnessed. You see, Elizabeth stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Hannah, her voice cracking. She was getting aggressive. I had to defend myself. She was a threat. The words hung in the air, absurd and hollow. Hannah hadn't moved a muscle besides standing up. Hannah said nothing. She simply held Elizabeth's gaze. She let the silence stretch, letting Elizabeth's pathetic lies unravel in the dead air. Every second that passed amplified the gravity of the flight attendant's transgression. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hannah spoke. Her voice was preternaturally calm, each word enunciated with chilling precision. It wasn't a shout. It was quieter than her previous requests, yet it carried more weight than any scream. "You have just made the biggest mistake of your professional life," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a prophecy. Hannah then turned her head slightly, her gaze flicking past Elizabeth to where Kate stood, pale and trembling. "Kate," she said, her voice still level, "please inform Captain Miller that I require his presence in the cabin immediately upon landing. Tell him there has been a serious incident involving a crew member and a passenger assault." The formal language, incident, crew member, passenger assault, was like a series of nails being hammered into the coffin of Elizabeth's career. Elizabeth opened her mouth to object, to shout, to say something, anything, but no words came out. The sight of Hannah's absolute composure, her refusal to be a victim, had shattered Elizabeth's own sense of control. She had expected tears, shouting, a hysterical scene she could then frame as proof of the passenger's instability. She had not expected this. This cold, unbreakable poise was more intimidating than any physical retaliation. Hannah then sat back down in her seat, 3A. She did not touch her cheek. She did not look at her ruined laptop. She simply folded her hands in her lap, faced forward, and waited. She had collected all the data she needed. Now it was time for the analysis and the inevitable conclusion. The rest of the flight to Teterboro was a journey through a vacuum. Elizabeth retreated to the galley, her face ashen. She leaned against a counter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She alternated between replaying the slap in her mind and trying to concoct a story that could possibly save her. But she knew, in the unforgiving hierarchy of private aviation, the client was king. And she had just struck a client. Kate, after a moment's hesitation, walked nervously to the cockpit door and relayed the message to the co-pilot. She avoided looking at Elizabeth. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The two businessmen spoke in low, urgent whispers, occasionally glancing back at Hannah, who sat as still as a statue, and at the galley where Elizabeth was having a silent, complete breakdown. The luxury of the cabin now felt like a gilded cage hurtling through the sky toward a reckoning that was as certain as the sunrise. For Elizabeth Flowers, the world had irrevocably changed in the time it took to swing her arm. The descent into New Jersey was smooth, a stark contrast to the turbulence that had ripped through the cabin's social fabric. As the Gulf Stream's wheels kissed the runway at Teterboro Airport, the premier private aviation hub on the East Coast, the sound seemed to signal the end of Elizabeth Flowers' world. As the seatbelt sign pinged off, the two businessmen gathered their belongings with unusual haste. They shot apologetic, uncomfortable glances toward Hannah, murmuring, "Are you all right?" before scurrying down the steps and into a waiting black car, eager to escape the radioactive atmosphere of the plane. Elizabeth composed herself with a visible effort, her face a pale, taut mask. Her plan was to pretend the incident hadn't happened to clean up and to disembark as if it were any other flight. She began collecting glasses with trembling hands. "You may leave," Hannah said, her voice calm and clear from her seat. She hadn't moved. Elizabeth froze. "Excuse me, the other passengers are gone. Your active duties for this flight are concluded. You may disembark." Hannah repeated her tone, leaving no room for argument. A flicker of Elizabeth's old defiance returned. "We have post-flight procedures to complete, ma'am. I can't leave until the cabin is cleared and secured." It was a desperate grasp for the flimsy shield of protocol. "That won't be necessary," Hannah said simply, her gaze fixed on the front of the cabin. Just then, the main cabin door opened. It wasn't the ground crew coming to clean. A man in a sharply tailored dark suit stepped aboard. He had a severe haircut, an earpiece, and the watchful, impassive eyes of a career security professional. He was followed by another man, older with kind eyes and a familiar face, to the crew, Frank Miller, the head of operations for Executive Fleet's East Coast Division. Elizabeth's heart plummeted. Why was a senior manager meeting the plane incident reports were usually handled over email days later? Frank Miller ignored Elizabeth completely. His eyes scanned the cabin and landed on Hannah. A look of deep concern crossed his face. He walked directly to her. "Dr. Braddock," he said, his voice a mixture of respect and alarm. "We received a priority alert from the aircraft's internal comms system. Are you all right?" The report was unclear. The name hit Elizabeth's ears, but it didn't immediately connect. Braddock. It was the name on the manifest. But Dr. Braddock, and the deference in Frank Miller's voice. It was the tone reserved for the highest-level clients, the ones who owned entire fleets, not just chartered a single flight. Elizabeth watched a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach as Hannah finally stood up. "I'm fine, Frank," Hannah said, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there before. But the flight was far from satisfactory. She gestured toward her ruined laptop. "And there has been a serious breach of conduct by a member of your crew." Frank's gaze followed hers to the laptop, then to Elizabeth, who was standing, frozen by the galley. For the first time, he acknowledged her presence, and his expression hardened into one of pure, unadulterated fury. Before he could speak, the cockpit door opened. Captain Robert Miller, a veteran pilot with silver hair and a commanding presence, stepped into the cabin. He had been informed by his co-pilot of the requested meeting, but knew none of the details. "Ms. Braddock," he began, looking at Hannah. "My first officer said you wished to speak with me." "Captain," Hannah acknowledged with a nod. It was then that the final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Elizabeth. The ground crew supervisor, a man she knew well, appeared at the door. He looked past everyone, his eyes landing on Hannah. "Welcome back, Dr. Braddock," the supervisor said warmly. "Your personal vehicle is waiting on the tarmac as requested. We've already loaded the luggage from your primary hangar. Will you be needing the G700 prepped for the return flight to Geneva on Sunday, or shall we keep it here at Teterboro? Your primary hangar, your G700. Return flight." The words swirled in Elizabeth's head, refusing to form a coherent thought. And then they did. They coalesced into a single, world-shattering realization. This wasn't just a passenger. This wasn't a client. This was the owner. This was Dr. Hannah Braddock, the founder of Aura Innovations, the reclusive tech billionaire whose name was on the registration documents for this very aircraft, N700 BW, W-A-W-W, Aura Braddock. It had been right there in front of her the entire time. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. She swayed, grabbing the edge of the galley counter for support. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, unbreathable. She had not just spilled coffee on a client. She had not just insulted a passenger. She had assaulted with physical force the billionaire who owned the plane. The billionaire who was one of Executive Fleet's largest and most important clients. Hannah saw the moment of realization dawn in Elizabeth's eyes, the flicker of confusion, the widening horror, the final crushing weight of understanding. Hannah turned to the captain. "Captain Miller, I believe we have a great deal to discuss. Yourself, myself, Mr. Miller from Operations," she said, nodding at Frank, "and your 2 flight attendants." Her gaze settled on Elizabeth, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as the void outside the window. "All of us. Right now." The cabin of the G700, once a symbol of luxury, transformed into a makeshift courtroom. The air was thick with tension. Frank Miller stood near the front, his arms crossed, his expression grim. Captain Miller, his face a mask of disbelief and professional horror, stood near his cockpit door. Kate, the junior attendant, was brought from the galley. She stood near the back, wringing her hands and looking at the floor, visibly terrified. And in the middle of it all were Hannah and Elizabeth. Hannah sat calmly in one of the plush leather seats, the very picture of composure. Elizabeth stood before her, her body rigid, her face a ghastly shade of white. The confident, sneering woman from the flight was gone, replaced by a trembling, cornered creature. "Let's be clear about what happened on this flight," Hannah began, her voice even and measured. She addressed the captain directly, but her words were for everyone. "From the moment I boarded your senior flight attendant, Miss, Flowers treated me with hostility and suspicion. The service was dismissive, unprofessional, and predicated on an obvious and frankly insulting judgment of my appearance." Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, a desperate denial on her lips. "That's not true. I treated her like any other passenger." "Is that so?" Hannah's eyebrow arched slightly. "Did you demand to see the boarding confirmations of the other 2 gentlemen? Did you offer them a blanket? Did you speak more than 3 words to them at a time? Kate, you were present. Please describe the disparity in service." All eyes turned to Kate. The young woman flinched her gaze, darting from Hannah to the furious glare of Elizabeth, and then to the stern face of Captain Miller. This was the moment she had been dreading. Her career hung in the balance. Siding with Elizabeth might save her from the senior attendant's wrath, but lying to a client, especially this client, was unthinkable. Taking a shaky breath, Kate spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It was different. Elizabeth was very attentive to the other passengers. With Miss Braddock, she was short. "Thank you, Kate," Hannah said gently, before turning her focus back to the primary issue. The unprofessionalism escalated when Ms. Flowers deliberately spilled hot coffee on my personal property. It was turbulence. Elizabeth shrieked, her composure cracking completely. I told you the plane jolted. It was an accident. Captain Miller, Hannah said, turning to the pilot. Please access the flight data recorder. Tell me between 14:30 and 14:40. Zulu time, did this aircraft experience any turbulence significant enough to cause a seated flight attendant to lose her balance and spill a full pot of coffee? The captain paled. He didn't need to check the recorder. No, Dr. Braddock. We had a smooth flight path all the way from cruising altitude. There were no significant deviations or turbulence events recorded. The captain's statement hung in the air, dismantling Elizabeth's primary defense. Frank Miller shook his head in disgust. She's lying. Elizabeth insisted, her voice growing hysterical. They're all against me. She was the one who was aggressive. She stood up. She got in my face. I was threatened. The slap. It was self-defense. This was the final desperate lie. Hannah let it hang in the air for a moment, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod to Frank. I anticipated there might be a difference in recollection, Hannah said calmly, which is why Aura Innovations equips all my personal assets, planes, vehicles, residences, with state-of-the-art security suites. This includes passive encrypted audio recording within the cabin. It's a measure to protect conversations regarding sensitive intellectual property. Frank Miller tapped the screen of a tablet he was holding. Dr. Braddock, with your permission. Proceed, Frank, Hannah said. Frank turned the tablet so everyone could see the audio waveform on the screen. He pressed play. The cabin was suddenly filled with the clear, high-fidelity sounds of the last hour. The polite murmur of the businessman, the clink of glasses, and then Elizabeth's voice, dripping with disdain. Audio, you should really be more careful with your things in the aisle. Audio, we're on an aircraft. Turbulence happens. Then Hannah's calm, firm response. Audio, I believe you're mistaken. You spilled the coffee. The recording played out the entire exchange, word for word. The tension in the cabin became unbearable as they heard Elizabeth's escalating anger, her refusal to apologize, and her condescending remarks about Hannah's cheap toy of a laptop. They heard Hannah's calm, repeated request for an incident report. Then they heard the sound of Hannah standing up, a simple rustle of fabric. It was followed immediately by Elizabeth's snarled command, "You will sit down." And then the sound, the sharp, ugly crack of the slap. It was even more shocking on the recording, stripped of all context, but the raw sound of violence. It was followed by a gasp, clearly identifiable as Kate's. Finally, there was Elizabeth's frantic, pathetic attempt to frame the narrative. Audio, you see, she was getting aggressive. I had to defend myself. She was a threat. The recording fell silent. There was no sound of aggression from Hannah. No threat. Just the calm, chilling prophecy. Audio. You have just made the biggest mistake of your professional life. Frank stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a strangled sob from Elizabeth. The audio evidence was irrefutable, a perfect damning record of her actions and her lies. Captain Miller looked as if he'd been struck himself. Frank Miller's face was like stone. Kate was openly weeping now, her shoulders shaking. Elizabeth stared at Hannah, her eyes wide, with a terror that went beyond losing her job. She was seeing a kind of power she had never understood. It wasn't the loud, demanding power of the businessman she fawned over. It was a quiet, systemic power that saw everything, recorded everything, and judged with absolute factual precision. Frank Miller spoke, his voice cold as ice. Elizabeth Flowers, your employment with Executive Fleet is terminated effective immediately. You are to surrender your ID and all company property. Security will escort you from the premises. He wasn't finished. Dr. Braddock is the registered owner of this aircraft. Your actions constitute not only a gross violation of company policy, but also criminal assault. Given the evidence, Executive Fleet will be cooperating fully with the Port Authority Police. You have assaulted a client on private property. You are banned for life from Teterboro and every affiliated private airfield in our network. We will also be recommending your permanent revocation of credentials to the National Business Aviation Association. You will never work in this industry again. Each sentence was a hammer blow, systematically destroying not just her job, but her entire career, her entire life. Elizabeth Flowers finally crumpled, sinking to the floor of the cabin. She once ruled, her body racked with desperate, hopeless sobs. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had, with a single prejudiced act of violence, erased her own future. Being escorted off the tarmac at Teterboro by Port Authority Police was only the first step in Elizabeth Flowers' precipitous fall from grace. The bubble of privilege she had inhabited for 15 years didn't just pop. It exploded, exposing her to a world she had only ever looked down upon from 40,000 feet. The initial charges were for simple assault, but Hannah Braddock's legal team, a phalanx of the most formidable corporate lawyers in the country, intervened. The incident hadn't occurred in a public space. It happened on a privately owned vehicle, which in the eyes of aviation law carried a weight similar to a private residence. The charges were elevated, and the case became a matter of public record. Within days, the story leaked. An anonymous source, likely one of the two businessmen who had witnessed the event and recounted it in horrified detail at his country club, tipped off a popular aviation industry blog. The headline was brutal: Executive Fleet Attendant, fired after assaulting passenger who owned the plane. The story went viral. It was a perfect storm of Schadenfreude-class warfare and racial justice. Elizabeth Flowers, whose name was now irrevocably linked to the incident, became the face of prejudice in the luxury service industry. Her photo, a stern-looking corporate headshot, was plastered everywhere. She was doxed, ridiculed, and turned into a meme. The comment sections were a torrent of vitriol. She was forced to delete all her social media, effectively becoming a digital ghost. Her professional life was annihilated. As Frank Miller had promised, Executive Fleet ensured her name was blacklisted. Every charter company, every fractional ownership program, from NetJets to FlexJet, immediately flagged her as ineligible for hire. Her FAA credentials, while not immediately revoked, were now permanently stained by a documented history of passenger assault. No commercial airline would touch her. Her career, the sole source of her identity and pride, had vanished overnight. Elizabeth's personal life crumbled in tandem. Friends from the industry, terrified of being associated with her, stopped returning her calls. The man she had been casually dating, a regional pilot for a major airline, broke things off with a curt text message saying he couldn't risk the professional blowback. She was a pariah, forced to sell her overpriced condominium to cover her mounting legal fees. She moved into a cramped, dingy apartment in a rundown part of Queens. The carefully curated life of vicarious luxury was gone, replaced by the smell of boiled cabbage in the hallways and the constant wail of sirens in the street. Her first lawyer urged her to accept a plea bargain, to show remorse, to apologize publicly to Dr. Braddock. But Elizabeth's bitterness had metastasized. In her mind, she was the victim. She had been tricked by Hannah's plain clothes. She had been provoked by her insolence. She railed against a world that would allow a billionaire to destroy a working woman's life over a simple misunderstanding. She fired the lawyer and hired a less reputable one who was willing to feed her narrative of victimhood. They went to court. The audio recording was played. Kate, though terrified, testified truthfully. Captain Miller testified about the lack of turbulence. The two businessmen subpoenaed to appear corroborated the entire event. Elizabeth's case collapsed in less than a day. She avoided jail time, but was sentenced to 2 years of probation, a hefty fine she had no way of paying, and 500 hours of mandatory community service. She was also ordered to attend intensive anger management and racial sensitivity counseling. 6 months after the incident, Elizabeth was working as a cashier at a discount grocery store. Her once manicured hands were now raw from handling rough cardboard and cold produce. Her severe blonde bob had grown out, her dark roots showing. The customers were rude, the work was monotonous, and the pay was a pittance. One afternoon, a young black woman came through her line, dressed in a university hoodie and jeans, juggling a laptop and a pile of textbooks. For a fleeting second, Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. A wave of nausea and rage washed over her. She scanned the woman's items with jerky, aggressive movements, her face a mask of resentment. She didn't see a student. She saw a ghost of her own, making a symbol of everything she had lost. She still hadn't learned. The karma wasn't just in losing her job or her status. It was in being trapped in the prison of her own unchanged, unexamined prejudice. She had fallen from a great height, but she still had no idea just how far she had to go, because she refused to look at the ground she herself had broken. While Elizabeth Flower's life was unraveling thread by painful thread, Dr. Hannah Braddock was meticulously weaving a new tapestry. She felt no thrill of victory, no surge of satisfaction at the news of Elizabeth's cascading misfortunes. When Frank Miller had called to update her on the legal proceedings and Elizabeth's subsequent blacklisting, Hannah had felt only a profound sense of weariness. The red mark on her cheek had faded within hours, but the incident left a deeper, more resonant sting, the weary ache of a battle she had fought her entire life, manifesting yet again in the most unexpected of places. To her, Elizabeth wasn't a singular villain to be vanquished. She was a predictable data point, a symptom of a systemic flaw that ran much deeper than one bitter employee. Revenge was a closed loop, a waste of energy. Progress was the only algorithm worth running. A week later, David Chen, the global CEO of Executive Fleet, walked through the lobby of the Aura Innovations Tower in Manhattan. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. The building itself was an extension of its founder, minimalist, brilliant and quietly intimidating. There was no opulent marble or gaudy art. Instead, the walls were lined with dynamic displays, showcasing real-time global energy consumption, shifting weather patterns and the silent, efficient dance of data across continents. It was a cathedral of information, and Chen felt like an analog relic in a digital world. He had spent the entire flight from London rehearsing apologies, his palms sweating. He had listened to the damning audio file 12 times, each playback making him flinch. The sound of that slap was the sound of his company's reputation being shattered, the sound of stock prices plummeting, the sound of his own career ending. His plan was simple: prostrate himself, offer to fire the entire flight crew, captain included, and promise to personally oversee a review of their training protocols, all in the desperate hope of salvaging the 9-figure Aura account. He was led into a conference room on the 80th floor that seemed to float above the city. Hannah Braddock sat at the head of a long obsidian table, not in a power suit, but in a simple, elegant, dark blue dress. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice calm. "Thank you for coming." "Dr. Braddock," he began, his voice strained. "Please allow me to offer my most profound, my most sincere apologies. What happened on that flight was inexcusable, unforgivable. It is a stain on my company, and I take full personal responsibility. The employee in question, Elizabeth Flowers, has been terminated and blacklisted. The rest of the crew have been placed on indefinite leave, pending a full investigation. Whatever you need, whatever it takes to make this right, we will do it." He was rambling, the carefully rehearsed words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. Hannah listened patiently, her hands folded on the table. She let the silence hang in the air after he finished a quiet pressure that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. Finally, she spoke. "Your apologies are noted, Mr. Chen. But firing people is the easy answer. It's a public relations maneuver, not a solution. In my field, when a critical component fails, you don't just replace the component. You analyze the entire system to understand what caused the failure. You find the power surge, the design flaw, the environmental stressor. Elizabeth Flowers was a failed component. I want to talk about the flawed system that allowed her to operate with that mindset for 15 years. Chen could only nod, completely disarmed by her analytical approach. "Your company culture," Hannah continued, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge, "has been designed consciously or not to reward a certain type of service for a certain type of client. It teaches your staff to equate wealth with a specific aesthetic, a white face, an expensive suit, a loud voice. Anyone who falls outside that narrow parameter is treated as an anomaly at best or a threat at worst. That is not a training issue. That is a foundational philosophical crisis." She slid a thick folder across the polished table. Its label was simple: the Braddock Initiative. "I have spent the last week analyzing this problem," she said, "and I have engineered a solution." Chen opened the folder with a sense of dread and fascination. It wasn't a list of demands or penalties. It was a comprehensive, multi-million-dollar proposal for a top-to-bottom overhaul of his company's entire human resources and client-facing operations. "I am not pulling the Aura account," Hannah stated, and Chen felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy. It was immediately followed by a chilling realization as she continued. "On the contrary, I am proposing an investment, a partnership. You are going to help me fix this." She walked him through the key pillars. First was blind recruitment, using software to anonymize applications, stripping out names, ages, and photos to ensure that hiring managers were evaluating candidates on pure merit, not unconscious bias. Second was immersive empathy training, a program developed with sociologists and powered by Aura's proprietary VR technology. "Your crews will no longer watch stale PowerPoint presentations," she explained. "They will put on a headset and stand in a virtual cabin dealing with a non-verbal autistic child, a passenger suffering a severe anxiety attack, or a client who looks just like me, and their performance will be analyzed." The third pillar was a permanent incognito audit program, where a diverse roster of vetted individuals would fly executive fleet to provide constant real-world feedback on service consistency. The final pillar was a personal one, a fully endowed scholarship fund to create pathways for talented individuals from underrepresented communities to enter the prohibitively expensive world of private aviation. "I am not just a client, Mr. Chen," Hannah concluded, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "I am now your partner in dragging your company's culture into the 21st century. My company will provide the technology. My personal foundation will provide the funding for the scholarship. Your company will provide the platform and the will to implement these changes across your entire global operation within 12 months. If you refuse, I will take my business, my technology, and this entire story to your biggest competitor and let them reap the benefits of this evolution. The choice is yours." David Chen sat back, stunned. He had come prepared for a battle, for a negotiation, for an execution. He was not prepared for a revolution. He was being offered a lifeline that was also a mandate, a chance to save his company by being forced to make it profoundly better. There was only one possible answer. "Yes, Dr. Braddock," he said, his voice filled with a new and unexpected sense of purpose. "We accept your partnership." Weeks later, Hannah sat in a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, a world away from boardrooms and private jets. Across the table from her was Kate, the junior attendant. The young woman still looked haunted, picking at the sleeve of her sweater. "I should have said something sooner," Kate whispered, looking into her cup. "When she spilled the coffee, I saw it. I knew it wasn't an accident. But I just froze. I'm so sorry. You were a junior employee in a hostile work environment, faced with a choice between your conscience and your career," Hannah replied gently. "Fear is a powerful force. But courage isn't the absence of fear, Kate. It's acting in spite of it. And when you were put on the spot when it mattered most, you chose to tell the truth. That shows a depth of character that no training manual can teach. That is integrity." Hannah leaned forward slightly. "I have a question for you. What do you want to do with your life? Not what you think you should do, but what is your real ambition?" Stunned by the question, Kate stammered, I've always loved the logistics of it all. Not serving the drinks, but understanding the flight plans, the fleet management, the incredible puzzle of getting the right aircraft and the right crew to the right place at the right time. But school for that is so expensive. It was never an option. A warm, genuine smile spread across Hannah's face. The Braddock Initiative Scholarship Fund has its first official candidate. We will cover your full tuition and living expenses for a degree in aviation management at Embry-Riddle or any top university of your choice. Learn the puzzle, Kate. Master it. Because when you graduate, there will be a management track position waiting for you at the new executive fleet. We need people with your integrity to become the new standard. The tears that filled Kate's eyes were not of fear or guilt, but of overwhelming, life-altering gratitude. A door she never even knew existed had just been thrown wide open. Later that evening, standing at the window of her office, Hannah looked out at the infinite web of lights that was New York City. She thought of the two paths that had diverged from a single ugly moment on her plane. One Elizabeth's a downward spiral into a dark, bitter place of her own making. The other, Kate's an upward trajectory into a future bright with promise. Hannah hadn't created either path. She had simply used her power to remove the obstacles from one and let the other follow its natural destructive course. It wasn't about owning the plane. It was about having the vision and the will to redirect its flight path and to elevate everyone who deserved to be on board. That was the only true measure of her power. In the end, this story serves as a powerful reminder that wealth and power are not always loud or ostentatious. True influence often lies in quiet character, and real consequences stem not from who we offend, but from the actions we choose. Dr. Hannah Braddock wielded her immense power, not for petty revenge, but for sweeping reform, turning a moment of personal injury into a legacy of opportunity. Elizabeth Flowers, on the other hand, became a cautionary tale of how prejudice left unchecked is a form of self-destruction, a poison that corrodes the soul long before it costs you your job. What do you think was the karma Elizabeth received too harsh, or was it a fitting consequence for her actions? Does true justice lie in punishment or in reform? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and thought-provoking, please please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more real-life stories of justice, consequence, and the hidden dynamics of power. Thank you for listening.